Peregrine took my lad. There is a task now to be done. Another opportunity for one of the Shire folk to prove their great worth. You must not fail me. Quiet. Kill him. afraid.
And Rohan will answer.
Well, hello, and it is time for something completely different from Star Wars. Because I get asked to do this about every few months or so, so I've finally done The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, The Lighting of the Beacons of Gondor. So I think it's just called The Lighting of the Beacons. But it's so hard to find a recording of the same thing that gets played in the live to picture version, and then there's no real recording of the live to picture version that is sort of appropriate, really. So I've had to sort of piece together bits and pieces. So I'm sorry about the audio. What I'll probably do is just do like a little NotePerformer thing, just so we can hear it. What I'm going to try and do is the trouble is that I'll have to kind of record this. I mean, just sort of like playing it. So I think what I'll do is I'll just go through all of this now, which is long, and just play it, just the NotePerformer version. So, I mean, obviously it's not going to be anywhere nearly as good as a real orchestra, or even samples for that matter. But you'll get the idea. And then at least it's sort of complete. I mean, the trouble is, of course, you won't be able to see the whole thing on the page, but there we go. Just one of those things. There's not much high wind anyway in most of this, really, so they're the most important bit of the strings of the brass. So here we go. So that is it. And I will come back to that full score at some point. But basically, that's what it is in NotePerformer. It's so synthy, it's unbelievable. Just nothing like a real orchestra at all. Pardon me. So this is about an hour into the film of the extended edition, or 43 minutes, 47 seconds of the original live to picture version, where they don't do the extended version, I don't think. Yes, I mean, let's take us through. I mean, the first observation really is that the orchestration is completely, totally, conceptually different from virtually any other Hollywood score, because it was designed that way by Howard Shore, so that it was all based on range and pitches, not blends at all. And so if you're used to the sort of blends, the sort of differentiated orchestration that normally occurs, this won't occur, really. I mean, there is a certain amount of differentiation, interestingly, where you might have sort of melody in the horns and not anywhere else, that sort of thing. But generally speaking, it's quite rare. So you'll see that, you know, violas, cellos and bassoons, of course, double bass, and of course we'd have contra, probably flute and oboe share, flute 2 and oboe 2 share. So all that sort of thing is all the way through the score. So for example here, you know, bassoons and double bass, horns and cello, you know, everything is blended essentially. Those are going to be tubas and trombones and things like that, where they're slightly different. So I've sort of shown those on here. And it's all about themes, really, isn't it? I mean, you know, the whole thing is about thematic material and the way it sort of links in. It's really interesting, actually, just listening to that cue of the lighting of the beacons. Just this little bit going up here remind me of that Caradras moment in Fellowship. That's sort of 117 or so. I don't have access to that at the moment, so I can't check to see how similar it is. But it seems very reminiscent, unless I'm misremembering something. So it's all this bit here where we get this sort of thing in the strings, basically, with that sort of cascade. Which is basically a big Dorian mode. So that's sort of what it is. Whoops, in edit mode. Yeah, I'm sure that's sort of like a mountain type sort of motive, but I haven't written it in because I wasn't sure. Because I'm not altogether certain about a lot of this stuff. There are lots of experts on YouTube who are far better qualified than me to do it. But basically, you know, as with all of these things, I'm sort of looking at it from a composer point of view, not an analyst's point of view necessarily, because I'm not an analyst really. So as much as I sort of pretend that I am, I'm not. The main thing is that it starts with this really interesting sort of theme, sort of weakness and redemption. Now, all of these page numbers refer to Doug Adams's amazing book, The Music of the Lord of the Rings films, a comprehensive account of Howard Shore's scores. Oh, hello. There's a whole chapter on the lighting of the beacons and all sorts of things. And I don't want to sort of replicate his work, because that's kind of very unfair without sort of crediting him at all, although I have credited him, but you know, I haven't used it with any permission at all. So, you know, I need to tread a little bit carefully with this sort of stuff. But basically, we have an interesting 4-note cell, which is this, which he refers to as the weakness and redemption, and goes into quite considerable detail about what that actually means. Which, if you've got access to the book, then if you don't have access to the book, then I heartily recommend that you do get access to the book. And we hear it you know, that sort of different thing. And it's under various guises, so it can be a minor chord with a flat 6 or a major chord with a flat 6 or some other variant of that. But basically the flat 6 is the one, or the, you know, added 6 is the main sort of category of it, and it's definitely a 4-note motive. And it occurs quite a lot. You know, he talks about this, which is that scores, he says, Shore's score represents this concept not with a single theme, but with a 4-pitch collection that runs throughout the score. And it's sort of developed, you know, slightly. So we'll come back to this, because you'll see how this gets embedded a little bit into the lighting of the beacons. And of course, before the lighting of the beacons, there's this, you know, the Orcs raid on Osgiliath, where they essentially just sort of completely overrun it. What I found interesting is that we get this sort of interesting set of chords where we've got C minor to E minor, which is a sort of chromatic immediate shift, because usually it would be an E, you know, E flat, but here it's E minor. Then it goes to F sharp minor, so a completely different sort of sudden shift, really, with no notes in common. But what you'll appreciate is this weakness and redemption theme, which is now sort of melodicized on an offbeat, which is really unusual. And it's sometimes really awkward. I mean, if you were trying to orally dictate this, it would be very complicated, because, you know, there are a lot of these sorts of strange oblique things. And also, you know, F sharp minor, but we get this, you know, it's very discordant indeed. And we actually end up with a sort of almost, you know, F sharp minor with that major 7th chord. But it's in a completely different context than the ones that you would find in John Williams, and they're not sort of modally derived. So it's purposefully done that way. It's sort of something's not quite right type sort of thing. And that's what it signifies. We also get the flat 6 in the following bar, but not in this bar. There's already a lot going on, I guess. So, and then we get these sort of stock root position progressions as well, which is you know, quite prominent. I like this sort of next bit, because it exemplifies how you know, hope enters. So when he looks to the mountains where the beacons are, we get this sort of really interesting progression. That sort of idea. And it's quite interesting the way it's voiced as well. So that sort of bar 12, 11, 12, that sort of area. Let's see if we can sort of go there. Yes. Yeah, so interesting that the F sharp is right bang in the middle of the range of everything, and it's duplicated in all of the various other instruments. So you'll see how much doubling there is with all of this. So that's like, you know, basically everything. But I love that little motive. It just gives it a little sort of, you know, something will happen, even though, you know, the men of Gondor are sort of completely doomed at this point. It's very interesting how the timpani part becomes a third above the lowest note, which I think is sort of really weird. Why didn't he just go to the D? And it's these little sort of orchestration choices which I find interesting, because it's just not something that I would ever consider doing, especially because he's already going to D anyway. With that, maybe the F sharp is there for some other reason, to go to the G later on, possibly. Would that all be done with 3 different timpanis, or you know, 2 you know, 2 with sort of that glide into the E flat? I don't know, I'd have to speak to a timpani player to find out, but it's quite an awkward timpani line, I think. But anyway, we get into that little sort of, I've called it a hope fragment, because he tends to use first inversions that sort of thing, to denote that sort of hopeful sort of mood. Then, in terms of what's on the score, we've got this Threat of Mordor retrograde. That sort of idea. In this case, it's going... And basically, any of those sorts of slight Mordor, thematic bits that you tend to get. It's called the Threat of Mordor. It's on page 104 and 105. He says, in The Return of the King, Shore often begins Threat of Mordor with a retrograded 3-level, 3-pitch cell. In doing so, the phrase comes to quote the opening 3 pitches of The Seduction of the Ring. That sort of thing. So it's intrinsically linked to that. And of course, thirds, that sort of thing, it is very much a sort of dark lord sort of motive as well. So then we get this sort of interesting, these sorts of held pitches which often end up in semitones. As basically the orcs prepared to kind of go across the river. And I found it very interesting. I noticed this here. If you sort of do that, it's a sort of almost distorted version of the ring motif, which is interesting. But it's sort of the evil of the ring. Mordor is the theme that Doug gives it in his book. So I'm using Doug as a reference for all of these things, so you can sort of check on all of them. It's a shame that there's no sort of proper index for this, so you have to keep sort of flicking through different things, but that's just the way it is. The evil of the ring, Mordor, is on page 16. That sort of idea. So it's a sort of, very, very similar sort of one, and it's elongated, of course, among a C pedal, C5 pedal. Then we've got an interesting chord here, which is a sort of 6-note cell, where you've got C minor. We've got a flat 6. We've also got a flat 9. And a sharp 4. That sort of idea. So we get these sort of really interesting hybrid chords and extended chords, which result as, possibly it's a melody which is sort of, verticalized. Sometimes that is the case. I can't think of one here in the way that it's as it's voiced. But anyway, that's just one of those observations. Then we get a sort of interesting thing where it's notated D flat, but actually it sounds like an A major chord, but with the C sharp on the bass, which is interesting. But then it goes to D flat minor at that point as well, if you regard the E as an F flat. And then occasionally you get this sort of, that sort of sharp 4 type effect. Again, completely different from the way that Williams uses it. I've just given it a little pitch set just from my understanding to see what similarities, if any, there were. And essentially there are none. Absolutely no similarities whatsoever. And especially when you've got these sorts of things, that sort of 521 chord. It's just, a cascade. That sort of type of idea. That's what I've sort of F major 7 with a sharp 5, sharp 9 type thing. But basically it's just sort of a big chord complex. But it's interesting to actually analyse them and see where they're from. And again, it's just a standalone chord. It's not from anything in particular. But then we've got this sort of little 3-note cell again, but this time it's sort of squished down. to those notes. Basically, it's the first sort of 3 notes of a D-flat harmonic minor scale, or C-sharp harmonic minor. But then we've also got interesting bits here as well. So we get this real scrunch, where things sort of get more and more scrunchy, and we end up with sort of clusters, all semitonal ones. Interesting here where we have a D-flat, but completely out of context. It's not sort of an Italian sixth, really. It's completely non-functional because of everything around it. And then we got a sort of interesting D-flat with a sharp 4, if we sort of take it completely out of context. But like that. So actually it ends up being sort of, you know, a real sort of mishmash of different things, but voiced slightly differently, because all of that is just going to be strings at that point, and lots of divisi strings as well. And I will go into the orchestration another time, but I don't want to get too bogged down with it at this point. What then happens is that we have the Realm of Gondor theme, but in augmentation. In other words, it's half speed. But at the same time, contrapuntally, it's with all of this sort of stuff going on as well. So that's 66. 66. It's rather appropriate, isn't it? So it's this bit here. And I suppose you could argue that, you know, this little 4-note cell has now become, you know, the Cruelty of the Orcs. It's sort of the same sort of thing. It's just that is a sort of going up or ascending version of this. Also the Cruelty of the Orcs as well. It's just a different representation of the same thing. So you can find that on page 96, and then it's actually written out as well. So interesting how that sort of occurs, because of course, you know, the realms, you know, Gondor is being attacked by the Orcs. So interesting that he uses both of those. I can't see any sort of particular sort of thing about the bass, because it just keeps getting more and more angsty as it sort of climbs up like that, and then eventually it goes into an aleatoric bit of complete clusters, all 4 ones. So basically all chromatic notes of 4 notes. In this case, it's all 10 notes of a chromatic scale, but excluding A and B flat for some reason, which he does tend to do. I think I noticed that in the Shelob cue, but I'd have to go back to listen to it. I haven't listened to it. I don't like listening to myself repeatedly. And then after this bit, we've got sort of interesting bit where it actually works out as an E minor 7 chord. Kind of loosey. I mean, it doesn't really sort of sound. It doesn't really sound like that sort of jazzy minor 7. So, in some respects, you know, Shaw says there are no minor 7s in Lord of the Rings. Well, they kind of are actually. But they're very rare, and they don't really sound like E minor 7s, even though written down it is, because of course we've got E, we've got G, we've got B, we've got D, but also, you know, it kind of changes because the melodically we've got sort of stuff going on as well, and really that's like a sort of foreshadow of what's happening later. So interestingly, you know, in terms of the mode, I think that's a Phrygian mode at that point, because it's 1 sharp. So the key would be G, that would be Do, and then you go up, Re. Oh, no, it's a sort of... no, it's a Re. It's a Dorian mode. So that's interesting. So actually it's the same mode that arrives later. Sorry, I should explain my thinking there. So with transpose mode, you take the key signature. So in other words, there's a 1 sharp in the key signature. That would be G major, and that's the Ionian mode. And then I go up the modes. So Ionian mode, Dorian mode, I don't punch. Phrygian mode, Lydian mode, Mixolydian, Aeolian, etc. Because it starts on A. So it's the step above Do. So that'd be the Re mode, which is the Dorian mode. But anyway, semantics, I suppose, because we're sort of in E minor. And then it ends up going to C minor anyway. And of course, we can see that actually that is completely a weakness and redemption fragment, because if I go all the way back, we can see that it's the same here. It's just without that flat 6. But in terms of the fragmentation, it's pretty much the same thing. So that's where we were. So we got some barans as well, and then we've got the same melody that we had before. So 100 bars later, after what we had before, it reappears, which is tremendous. I like things like that. It has that sort of nice sense of connectivity. Then we've got nice block chordal harmonization, where we see the hey, and Pippin climbs it, and really it's just all minor. This is about as close to Williams as he actually gets. You know, if I just did that sort of thing, then it would be suddenly Williams. But of course, it's all minims. It's all very simplistic. There's none of that sort of Williams-esque rhythmic elements to it at all. You'll notice also, because the violas can't play a low B, they just sort of jump up an octave. But they don't do that when it goes down to a bit later on, where they run out of keyboard, essentially. So he does really very much rely upon a range of instruments as his sort of orchestration. You'll see here it's horns, trombones, and bassoons, all that play that, which are just duplicating what the violas and cellos and double basses are doing as well. So then we've got more of this sort of discordant bit. This time, this sort of angular melody is now in the bass, so it gives it more ominous sort of feel to it. And then it's a sort of weird, sort of almost a hiatus, where we lose that sort of G flat, and then we're going up another bit of these sort of little chromatic moments, a sort of mountain danger motif, basically the sort of same thing that we had before. Then we're into A flat minor with an add 4, which is interesting, which is a throwback or a callback to the other bit. So it's almost like a sort of almost palindromic. So do you remember this bit here where we had the hope motif? Like that. And, you know, a few bars later, he does a sort of similar thing. Where we got another Dorian mode, which is untransposed in D as well. And then it's really the tower's on fire, and suddenly we're into the theme weakness and redemption question mark. So it's all, so it doesn't start with any flat 6, but I mean it does relate to it. It's just a big scale, but if you notice, we do hear some fragments of it. So they're not always chord tones. So sometimes they have sort of other notes, which can join in the main chord function. So it's interesting. So it is kind of a weakness and redemption thing, but it actually is transfigured into its own motif at that point. All the violins are doing, they're just basically arpeggiating the same chords. and then it repeats. And that sort of flow from minor to major is that sort of there is hope being lit, and he uses that sort of interesting sort of chord progression of just roots, really. I guess here it's sort of second inversion. I've just written E minor, but actually theoretically really is a second inversion. And we've got an interesting sort of 420 fragment. If I take the F away with A flat, C, D flat, but actually it's going to the wrong note. It's going to an E minor chord at that point. But there is that sort of connection with it, with this sort of weakness and redemption bit. And of course, a moment later, we've got it in full. In this time in the bass. And again, all of this is just chordal accompaniment, which is just doing pretty much mostly chord tones at that point. And then it's plain sailing for us after this. It's just this wondrous bit of score. It's just fantastic, majestic, where we've got this sort of redemption bit. Very, very complicated for the brass to do that. On a piano is, simple, really. Well, with two hands it's simple. Otherwise you're sort of Liszt territory at that point. But yeah, and also the rhythm as well. I mean, that's straight out of the Bruckner playbook, basically. That could be Locus Iste or Ecce Segedas Magna. Typical that sort of chromatic mediant shifts and things like that. And then a sort of semitonal shift using that again. Now it's sort of using it as a first inversion. Remember that sort of hope type of idea. And it just ramps up. Interesting how it sort of suddenly goes into that chordal. But don't forget that chordal bit here, which is bar 152, is reminiscent of this bar here, which is again going back to this sort of hope thing. So it's a really, really clever bit of foreshadowing, which is remarkable, actually, in terms of thought and concept. And that's sort of sometimes the sort of thing that gets lost on composing is the amount of thought that went into this is absolutely astronomical. And you must have had notes and scribbles all over the house, sort of remembering all of this stuff, because it's so difficult to just keep in your head. So a huge admiration, because it's incredibly difficult to do. And in a sense, the music speaks to us quite simplistically if you compare it to sort of John Williams. But then, this was written out of 3 or 4 years, I think. So he used the texts and Tolkien and the script and all sorts of things before even seeing any footage. So it's an interesting sort of thing. So we got this sort of chordal chord, which then basically, does that sort of scale bit that we saw before, the sort of weakness 1 and redemption. So then into F major, and it's more major. Little minor chord. So it really just follows. So it's all the sort of things that you should never do. So where the melody follows the chords in parallel motion. Marvellous. It works perfectly well. And it's very diatonic, all of the, the men of Gondor, because it's manly and human, it doesn't have the same harmony as elves and dwarves and things. So this is all sort of diatonic stuff and slightly modal as well. Almost poppy, but actually I think it's more folk. Just sort of doing that, if I just sort of brazenly do the chords, it doesn't have any sense of grandeur that it would have had. So I think at this point, let me see whether I can sort of try and find it in here. Here we go. You can feel the passion in the violins. Red means it's the same thing. Yeah, I mean, just fantastic. I didn't want to talk over it because it's too good. It would be rude. So we sort of got to this bit here, just where we have this wonderful elongated the Realm of Gondor theme, which is absolutely marvellous. I love it. And that's page 66 in Doug's book. So we put a little page reference number for those of you who want to have a look at it. Of course, it's written double half time. So what would normally be crotchets is now minims, or quarter notes are now half notes. And yeah, interesting how those chords work. So we've got trombone 1, trombone 2, then trombone 3, then bassoon 1, 2, then tuba, then contra. Amazing. I love it. And of course, because trombones actually play better in the middle of the stave, bass trombones would be sort of lower. People always think of trombones being a bass instrument, but it's a tenor instrument, hence the word tenor trombone. And I love it when the trumpets come in as well. We've got two who kind of almost start bom, 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 and you really want 6 trumpets because really you want them to do that. But of course they can't do that because otherwise it interferes with the melody because you're hitting the A before the A, which would be silly. So that's why he didn't do it. And then a rare bit of high wind. We haven't heard any at all, really. We've had little bits here before, but really the first time we actually hear them is 172. And it's interesting because you can have a look at this. If I go to let's go to around here. Look at how little. Piccolo, oboe, clarinet, blank, 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 blank. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Some trills. And nothing. So all that Realm of Gondor stuff, they don't do anything apart from 2 bars, and then they go back into the trill, that sort of monumental mountain trill bit, which is why I've put upper wind at that point. Yeah, just absolutely marvellous sort of chord progression, which just repeats, same key, Then we got this Dorian theme again. You don't really hear those oboes at all. They completely drowned out by the brass at that stage. Absolutely no hope of hearing those whatsoever. So I wonder how... I think he orchestrated this himself. Pretty sure he did. I can't get that to work, really, so I'm not going to bother trying. We know what it is. So that's really the end of that sort of whole section. And it's remarkable, isn't it? Because it's very simplistic in so many ways, but that just doesn't really tell you the story. The story is one of grandeur, and also all of these little callbacks and throwbacks to what we had before. Right at the beginning, everything is actually kind of in that first 15 or 16 bars. You don't really get a hint of Gondor particularly, but then we've heard that before in the film. So, it's I find it really interesting. And then right after the general pause, we get, Aragorn sort of going, oh, God, the beacons are lit. Really, it's just big sort of chordally based music, just chords. And we get little bits of this of weakness and redemption, but it's kind of distorted. It's more sort of redemption than weakness, like that. So it's interesting how it sort of plays. So I love those sort of changes. Just very sort of basic, sort of going from minor to a major chord, but a semitone higher. Like that. D sharp minor, F, G flat. And then it ends on that sort of trill with just violas actually at the end and violins. As Théoden, the late Bernard Hill, what a superb actor. I think one of the best performances in that whole film. Really, just, I would have followed into battle, no question. I'd have loved to have seen him play Henry V. I think it would have been a brilliant Henry V. And we rest on F major, because that's where it's journeyed to. There's no need to end or start a cue in the same key that you began it. Why? Absolutely no reason whatsoever. Yes, I'm delighted to bring this cue to you, and I think it's really interesting. I mean, it's so different from the John Williams work, and it's easy to kind of dismiss it in some ways. It's probably not brilliant to play necessarily, but it's incredibly effective, and it really speaks to the audience, and I think that's why it's sort of very loved music. I particularly like it as well, and I always have done, but then I've been a massive Lord of the Rings nerd fan for years as well. So and I mean from the books. My mother received a letter from Tolkien when she was about 19 years old, having read the Lord of the Rings the first time. And got a letter back from Tolkien. She sent him some amazing silhouettes of the characters and of the Gollum. He said it was the best likeness of Gollum he had ever seen up to that point, which I think was in 1968 when he was writing. So I'll try and find the letter and post it somewhere. I've obviously left Twitter, but I'm on Threads and Instagram. I think it's just a better platform really for me. So, yes, that is it. And I will do some of those orchestration things. So I think it'd be interesting because, some of the blends are actually quite interesting. The one I pointed out with the bassoons lower than the trombones, I think is a significant thing. If you're going to write like this, and of course, the Lord of the Rings sort of this franchise led on to so many sort of role-playing game type music, which has sort of gone into the games industry and all sorts of things. I mean, nobody would not be influenced by it. And I like the fact that it's got a real clarity to the orchestration in some ways. Even though everything is blended, you know, you can pretty much guarantee if that's doing it, the trombones are doing it, the cellos are probably doing it. In this case, they're not, but that's because they're not playing a chord. But there we go, bassoons and the cellos are. You know, the way it works is that way, and we'll go into it in a much more detail at a later date. I just wanted to bring you the music instead at this point. So yes, that was a lot of work. How many pages was it? 30 and 209 bars. So yes, and I'm sure there are a couple of things in it, so I will double check it again before I send it out there. But thank you for staying with me, and I hope to see you again very soon. Bye for now.